Hello everyone, and welcome back to another individual album review, this time of the newest album from JPEGMAFIA, Experimental Rap. Yes, I'm aware I'm quite late to this one. JPEGMAFIA released this album on May 21st, which interestingly was a Thursday and not a Friday, and I realized that I'd never really taken the time to properly check out JPEGMAFIA's album discography, although I had listened to his two most recent studio albums before this one, and I revisited them both in addition to listening through his first three albums multiple times each. I'm just talking about official studio albums. Admittedly, it was a few weeks ago that I did most of that listening, but if you want my overall thoughts on his first few albums, well, I want to be careful about how I discuss JPEGMAFIA's discography, because like with a lot of hip-hop albums, I gotta be honest and say that I don't fully understand everything about it, which means I feel weirder criticizing it than I do most music that I talk about. And yes, this is something I've talked about before, and I am trying to expand my knowledge of hip-hop, but there are a few things to note here specifically. One being that JPEGMAFIA has specifically talked about being frustrated with people assigning different meanings to his music than he intended, which is something that I do in a lot of my reviews because I am willing to admit that I don't understand. So I'll just say in advance, I will potentially do that in this video without realizing it. And a lot of JPEGMAFIA's music is based on experiences that I very much don't relate to, such as being a black man in America and also his experience in the military. But I can tell you what music I like and what music I don't like, and honestly, those first few studio albums in his discography are certainly interesting to say the least. They are largely based on shock value, but it's usually used for genuine social commentary, a lot of which is quite powerful, but there are also some questionable lines here and there, mainly when he tries to be satirical and doesn't do a very good job of it. But I also didn't find the music itself to really be up my alley. Don't get me wrong, I like experimental, out there music, and in some moments I really enjoyed what Peggy was doing on those albums, but a lot of the time it just wasn't really for me, even if there was the occasional song here and there that I found to be a total gem. So I'm not going to say JPEGMAFIA didn't deserve all the critical acclaim that he got, I'll just say his music wasn't really for me, at least not in terms of full albums. And then there was LP in 2021, which is considered by many people to be the best album of 2021 and one of the best albums of the 2020s, if not one of the best albums of all time. It's a modern classic in every sense of the word, and I liked it better than any of the three albums before it, and yet I still felt at a bit of a distance from the album. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad at all, and like everyone else, I absolutely love Hazard Duty Pay, and there were quite a few great bars on that album, but I just personally did not love it as a full project, largely because I found the production to be a little awkward sometimes, and I didn't always like the mixing, nor did I find the album as consistently compelling as a lot of people did. But that's just me. My favorite JPEGMAFIA album is actually 2024's I Lay Down My Life For You, which had I made a top 50 albums video for 2024, easily would have been on that list. To me, it felt like his most thoughtful album, where the shots taken at other people were still there and just as awesome as usual, but he also took a bit of a look in the mirror at his own flaws, and the album goes into some pretty goddamn heartbreaking places in the latter half. And it also had arguably some of his most experimental production and beats, which also were very well designed to fit the content of any given song. It's probably his most emotional album, and again, it's my personal favorite of his. Now, I knew pretty much nothing about this new album called Experimental Rap going into it, other than that the reviews were shockingly negative, or at least not nearly as positive as I would have expected on a new JPEGMAFIA album. And I'm noticing I've been talking recently about bias in music criticism, where I've mentioned a few albums that I believe are getting critical acclaim on artist name alone, and yet a lot of that same audience is very much not praising this JPEGMAFIA album, so maybe I should eat my words a little. Yes, bias is still a thing, and I'm not going to claim that it doesn't affect me, but I just found that interesting because there are examples where a super critically acclaimed artist will put out a new album and suddenly everyone decides it's really mediocre, if not bad. Take this album as an example. But the big parallel, or lack thereof, that I'm going to draw to one of those recent reviews is about something that I said in my most recent individual album review before this one, my review of the newest Boards of Canada album, where I mentioned the possibility that that review would end up completely going off the rails, and it didn't. This review, on the other hand, is largely going to be me talking about other things that are not specifically about this new JPEGMAFIA album, but that's the kind of content that I want to make sometimes. Just a heads up right now, in case you were just here to see straightforward music commentary. because I think it's very much worth talking about JPEG Mafia's public persona right now. I'll be honest and say that I haven't been super closely following his career and persona for very long, so I don't have as much context to talk about this as a lot of his hardcore fans do. But the thing that really confused me was his response to the criticism of this album, which includes his claim that if you don't like this album, that means you don't like him, but also a series of tweets that he made after he saw how critically panned this album has been. In said series of tweets, he basically said that people can say whatever they want about him, but at the end of the day, he's not an abuser, and that a lot of people listen to abusers. He went on to say that most people in the professional world aren't mature enough to separate art from artist, which doesn't really make sense to me considering his initial argument for this album was basically, well, I'm not a rapist or abuser, so that makes the album good. And it's also very much worth mentioning that a lot of the criticism he's received in recent years has to do with his collaboration with Kanye West, which I have conflicted feelings on. Look, I understand that he wanted to work with his idol, and honestly he has every right to do so. You don't have to support the things someone does as a person to see them as a great artist and still have that admiration and respect for their art. But what's more odd to me is the way that Peggy talks about Ye, almost as if Ye is just exempt from criticism because of how much Peggy admires his music. I'll get back to that a little bit when I talk about the album. Am I exaggerating a bit by saying that? Maybe, but it's why I use the word almost, although you could also argue that that might be an understatement. And look, with any of these larger topics I'm talking about in this video, I very well could be missing more important context, so feel free to let me know in the comments if you think I am. But it does strike me as odd the way that Peggy's beefs have occurred with certain artists, especially considering how far left-leaning he is and how much he is willing to start beef with people, and yet he made a post where he talked about loving Ye, but he was upset at him for collaborating with Freddie Gibbs. Now, I know Freddie Gibbs has had some pretty bad allegations against him. I've heard mixed things on whether or not they're valid. I'm not going to comment on that right now. I really don't know enough about it. But even if that might have something to do with Peggy's grudge against Freddie Gibbs, which it may or may not, honestly, I'm not sure any of the public really knows what went on between those two. It still wouldn't really logically make sense in that post because, again, this is Ye we're talking about, who's had some pretty serious allegations against him, in addition to all the anti-Semitism and other fucked up bullshit that he's been spitting everywhere. So while I'm not offended or anything by Peggy's decision to collaborate with Ye, there is a lot of hypocrisy showing in the ways that he's talked about it and his beliefs around separating the art from the artist. But the other big thing that confused me about Peggy's response to the criticism for this album is some allusions he made to the possibility that this may have all been some kind of social experiment. And by all this, I'm not entirely sure what that includes, if it's just the album or maybe his entire public persona recently. I mean, I saw the Pigeons and Planes interview, and I know I'm not the only one who felt like something was a little off. He talked in that tweet about not wanting to make people comfortable with this album, and he goes on to say that he gave sensitive industry people a personality to hate because that's what they wanted to do to me all along. He also went on to thank both his fans and his haters, but honestly I think the whole thing is revealing the insecurity behind it all, because as much as he claims that he wants people to give their honest opinion and he only wants people to say they like him and his music if they genuinely mean it, I'm not sure I buy that considering how whiny he's being about all of it. But that brings me to a very interesting topic of discussion to me, and one that I can't fully dive into as deeply as I'd like in this video, because even talking about it at all causes me to go down a bit of a rabbit hole that is going to delay me actually talking about the album. And I'm gonna do that anyway, but we could have this discussion for days if we wanted to. I'm talking about hypocrisy in general, and the core deep down belief a lot of us have that we're somehow above everyone else from a moral standpoint. Except when we don't have that belief. Yes, it's possible to believe one thing deep down at one moment, and then at another moment, we believe the complete opposite deep down. And here's where I gotta look inward at myself and really be realistic here. I would say in general, my deep down belief is that I'm just a regular guy, and I'm not somehow better or more morally correct than everyone else, but it's easy to be fooled into thinking self-centered narratives, often subconsciously. And all of this gets me thinking about myself and how it might be hypocritical of me to call out someone else's hypocrisy, because as someone who's been posting music reviews on this YouTube channel for almost 2 years now, with over 300 albums reviewed on this channel, there are definitely inconsistencies you can find if you go digging for them in different arguments I've made over the past 2 years. I'm not sure I can think of any examples off the top of my head, but go digging and I'm sure you'll find some, which I might not have a good argument to back up. And it's another reminder of just how complicated humans are, and to get a little bit personal here, I often wonder if I'm eventually going to reach a point where I'm detached from reality. I mean, part of me feels like I already am, but the more I admit it, hopefully the less big a problem it becomes. I'm just a person living my life, and one of the things that I enjoy doing is making online content about music and other things which I use music reviews as a disguise for. But I want to make it a goal for myself to always be reasonable and to be willing to take criticism. And while I think I should be able to achieve that goal, it doesn't mean that I won't make mistakes along the way. If you put yourself above everyone and adopt a mindset of, oh, I'd never do anything like that, when criticizing someone, you're putting yourself on a pedestal, and that can have bad consequences. Going back a little bit to the tweets that JPEGMAFIA made, Anthony Fantano actually has a really good video on it, which he posted in late May. And right now, at this time, that's not someone I necessarily want to be actively praising like that, even as a longtime fan of his videos, because I'm kind of pissed at him for how he's been handling the Halsey situation recently. Especially considering his criticisms of Peggy's deflection from the actual conversation feel weird to watch now, considering his bad responses to the criticism he's received. But again, I don't have to give him a pass just because I've been a fan of his videos for so long, but it's one of those situations where I have to ask myself, is something like this really worth giving away my fandom over? I mean, in the long term, as long as he doesn't hit any new lows, I don't see this making me no longer a fan of Fantano, but right now I'm really disappointed in him. And yet, I also recognize that if I get to a place where I have a larger audience, I'll probably have some sort of controversy at some point and say something that I regret and get called out for it. And I also recognize that I have some personal beliefs which I will stand by and not apologize for, which some people are going to disagree with. At the end of the day, you're never going to agree with anyone on absolutely everything, even important social issues. There are always going to be disagreements, which means it can be tricky to know where you draw the line between simply disagreeing with someone and cutting ties with someone because of said disagreements. So with everything going on with JPEGMAFIA and this potential social experiment he was doing, like I said, I'm very confused, and I'm not a big fan of that approach. It honestly makes me wonder just how much that experiment may have influenced other behavior, and it honestly might even play a role on this album. When JPEGMAFIA described this album, he talked about how he thinks he's the best experimental rap artist and that no one competes with him, and he wanted to name the album Experimental Rap because it's what he does and he wants people to think of him first when they think of this genre. Like how when people think of conscious rap, they think of Nas. Or when they think of mainstream rap, they think of Future. And again, it's hard to say how much of this is part of some character he's playing or how much of it is authentic. But another thing that really stood out to me that he said about this album is that it's very honest. And that definitely raises some concerns when you get into the content of the album, and I guess it's finally time for me to review the album itself. And this is a weird follow-up to I Lay Down My Life For You, because where that album was way more introspective and felt like him acknowledging his flaws, including relationship mistakes that he made, this new album doesn't show him continuing with that growth at all. In fact, it largely does the opposite. And alright, before I go any further, I just want to mention that I'm reviewing the version of this album with TSAR BOMBA on it, and the 2-minute and 13-second song called Degenerates Prayer. I haven't heard other versions of the album yet, and that's the one that I started reviewing before the tracklist was changed on a bunch of streaming services. So now that that's out of the way, what the hell happened? Honestly, here it just feels like JPEGMAFIA putting on full display the worst of himself, where I'm quite confident not all of the lyrics are honest, as in literal, considering some of the crazy shit he talks about here. But it is kind of concerning hearing him say that the album is so honest. I mean, okay, obviously it's not all meant literally. But anyway, I'm here to review the album and not whatever weird experiment he's doing, although we will come back to that later. And honestly, this album is an absolute goddamn mess. And look, I can't even say that I'm all that surprised after seeing the reviews, because again, it was an absolutely shocking negative reception this has gotten. But while Peggy's albums have absolutely always been largely based on shock value, it often felt like there was a point to it. His albums have always featured lots of lyrics that were actively anti-racism, anti-abuse, and much more that seemed to represent a desire for true change and acknowledging that he wasn't going to be liked by everyone, but wanted to stand up for what's right anyway. And I guess if I want to start this off on a positive note, there is a little bit of social commentary on this album, some of which is admirable. I like how he acknowledges his changing view on love and lust in Burning Hammer, and he calls out labels not caring about their artists on No Strippers in Heaven. I also like the First Amendment, which feels very clearly designed to be one of the more controversial moments here, with a sort of comedic tone in how he writes about the Charlie Kirk shooting, and I think it's pretty powerful when you consider the overall context that so many right-wingers used said shooting as a way to try and silence Democrats, like with Jimmy Kimmel's suspension last year. And Peggy is clearly not giving any fucks here, and he also adds in one of my favorite lines on the album because of its powerful message: all of this white-on-white violence too real. I guess now you know how it feels. Obviously talking about how so many white people have turned a blind eye to the many killings of black people, or worse, defended it. And that's not the only moment here where he talks about violence toward black people. For example, he mentions the killing of Emmett Till on The Ghost of Emmett Till. And I absolutely agree with Peggy bringing more awareness to this issue, but here's where I have to mention Chat, where he tries to be an activist by saying, "Free Rodney Hinton Jr." For those of you who don't know, and I didn't either until before this, Rodney Hinton Jr. is a man who is accused of killing a police officer after a completely different officer killed his son. Now, I could not find any confirmation anywhere that the accusations against Rodney are true, but it does very much seem true based on the research that I did. The general vibe I get seems to be that that happened. I could not find absolute proof of it, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But if Peggy means free him, as in don't give him the death penalty, then I agree. But Peggy shouts him out at the start of the song. And I say all this as someone who's a defender of his controversial track, "I Just Killed a Cop, Now I'm Horny," from his first album. It's probably one of my favorite JPEGMAFIA songs, as he helps to reveal the hypocrisy in white supremacists by playing the character of someone who kills a cop and points out the double standard that could go both ways. This moment on this album feels like it completely flies in the face of everything that made that song so great. Again, feel free to let me know if there's more context that I'm missing about this whole situation, but to me, this just seems ignorant, and I do not like it at all. And there are so many moments on this album that make no sense to me whatsoever and can come across as quite offensive. On War Over Land, he shouts out Mike Tyson, who is a convicted rapist and has had other abuse allegations too, and Peggy compares himself to him at one point on this album, as well as other horrible people such as Vladimir Putin, and he talks about Osama bin Laden like they're bros on the song Chat. And I could also point out the now deleted track "BOMBA," where in addition to calling himself a terrorist, he also says, "My bitch switch stylists, yours switch like Miss Garrison," who apparently is a trans character on South Park, and if Peggy is using this comparison as a brag, that's fucking disgusting. And the amount of misogyny all over this album is fucking gross. I could go on and on reading all the lines where he talks about fucking your bitch in ways that just make it sound like he thinks women are objects. And yeah, I get that Peggy has said things like this in other albums too, but not to the same extent as this album, where it doesn't feel like imagery used to prove a larger point, and rather feels more like he's trying to brag to everyone about how much better he thinks he is because he fucks more women. And some of the lines here are absolutely awful, including some fat shaming on Meet the Dealers, where he says, "My bitch don't eat dinner, I'm watching her weight." Or on No Strippers in Heaven, where he says, "Your bitch wide as a cow, we gon' milk you for sure." And there are so many examples of misogynistic lyrics on pretty much every song on this album, where there's no clear point to any of it, and the way that he talks about these women like objects is absolutely gross, and I'm not going to defend it just because he's JPEGMAFIA. And I watched a really good video about this album by the YouTuber Gabs, spelled G-A-B-S, all lowercase, called "Experimental Rap is JPEGMAFIA at his worst," which I would highly recommend watching, as I think the commentary Gabs does on this album is way more powerful than anything that I'm saying in this review. And that video also made one really good point that I want to mention here, which is that while a lot of people might defend this album's lyrics by saying, it's satire, it's not really clear what this album is satire of. Yeah, there's moments like Money, which is clearly about people who are too obsessed with their money, but I don't think the execution is very good, and the misogyny doesn't really feel like it fits with the song, even in a satirical way, in large part because it once again highlights how bad JPEGMAFIA is at satire. Honestly, it's been an issue I've had with his music for a while, even on albums that I like. And overall, on this album, the vast majority of it doesn't really seem to have much of a point, and even when he does aim for more genuine commentary, most of it feels like stuff that he's done before, and I just don't find it particularly interesting here. And I guess I could go on listing more bad lines, and I'm not going to go through them all, but to name a few, well, if you want an example of another one of the horrible ways he talks about women, on New Era he says, "Flew so many bitches out, they thought I was trafficking." That's also just a really cringy line, as is this line on Money. I miss my money, I love all my funding, like some people love on they cousins. And on Meet the Dealers, he seems to be trying to make a point about Elvis being problematic by highlighting that he died on the toilet, which we all know. I mean, maybe that line wasn't meant to be social commentary, I'm not really sure, but it's a cringy line in the context it's placed in. And there are so many other bad lines I'm not going to mention because there's just too many of them, but I will mention a few lines I do like, because there are some worth mentioning. New Era is a terrible song lyrically, but I do quite like when he says, I know my leader's a puppet, he lettin' Putin fuck him. There's also a line I really like on Burning Hammer, the FNN I'm packing gon' back me up, in myself I trust. And as much as I can't stand Chat as a song overall, I will praise the bar where he says, vote for Peggy, no funny shit, breaking the covenant, never missing my target like Thomas did, in reference to the attempted assassination of Donald Trump in July of 2024. And you know what? Going back to the social commentary, I do think War Over Land takes an interesting approach to the way that he talks about violence, which seems to be recognizing how potential for violent impulses lives within all of us, which humanizes people who start wars, reminding us that they are very much preventable. I could be totally wrong about what he's trying to say here, but it is kind of fascinating to me when he says things like, praying for peace, I really want war. But I'm not going to shy away from talking about some of the more under-the-surface elements of this album, I don't know what else to call them, where I'll quickly mention the title of the closing track, which is called, You Will Always Lose Money Chasing Women, but You Will Never Lose Women Chasing Money, which might be true in some ways, but also puts the emphasis on the mindset that men should be focused on fucking as many women as possible, rather than prioritizing stronger human connection, which is something that you likely will lose if you're just chasing money. No surprise that there's a song title like that on an album this misogynistic. But the other thing I want to talk about is how much this album seems to confirm JPEGMAFIA's huge admiration for Kanye West. And there's a few songs specifically that I want to point out. First, there's a song literally called Since I Met Ye, where he seems very happy with his decision to work with Ye and wants you all to know about it, including referencing On Sight from Yeezus in the first verse, which just so happens to be another questionable lyric on this album in terms of how he talks about a woman. There's also Chat, where he says, still bumping Ye, you know I was gonna. And most notably, there's Lights, which heavily samples all of the lights. And look, I understand separating the art from the artist. I'm often willing to do that myself. In fact, I will even do that with Kanye West's music. He's an artist whose discography I'm not super familiar with and have actually been trying to get into due to lots of my friends convincing me I've got to hear his albums. And I'll even admit, All of the Lights is a pretty great song. And from a musical standpoint, the sample is actually used pretty well on this song. But considering how much backlash JPEGMAFIA faced for collaborating with Ye, I just get the ick from how much he tries to defend him on this album. I'm not exactly sure what point he's trying to make, but it comes across as really detached from his audience, and... Okay, you know what? I'm going to take a bit of a step back and look at the full project as a whole. And it all comes back to the point about the social experiment. Considering everything I said about satire and the point that Gabs made in that one video, it leads me to wonder if this whole album was designed to see if his fans would give it a negative reaction. I'm not necessarily saying it was, I honestly don't know, but it's a genuine question I have, because considering his recent persona and the lead up to this album, the beefs, and this goddamn album itself, something has just felt really off about pretty much everything that has anything to do with JPEGMAFIA. And while I don't necessarily know how to feel about said social experiment as a concept, that's a completely different conversation I do not have time for right now, as I've already said way more in this video than I was planning on. I'm reviewing the album that's right in front of me. And I haven't even gotten to talking about the flows, beats, and production yet. And honestly, it's yet another reason this album fails. I've heard some people debating whether or not JPEGMAFIA only has one flow, and I think he has more than that, but he doesn't really use them particularly well here. Honestly, some of this rapping can get quite annoyingly repetitive, as can some of the instrumentals, and it becomes kinda hard to listen to at points. Look at a song like Baby Girl as a prime example. And when it comes to the overall sound and production, look, I get that it's meant to be experimental, but usually it either doesn't feel very experimental in the grander scheme of things, or it feels like it's trying way too hard to be edgy and cool and avant-garde, and it leads to some absolutely unlistenable moments like Meet the Dealers and Head. I like weird experimentation in music, but I guess that can go too far even for me, as this album shows. Or at least it shows that when said experimentation is not carefully crafted, it can lead to some absolutely terrible music that feels like throwing paint at a wall and seeing what sticks, and most of it doesn't even make it to the wall. There are some nice vocal samples here and there, and some of the melodic moments can be quite nice, like that one brief moment in Bridges on Fire, and sometimes the experimentation can be kind of interesting, like some of the synth work on Burning Hammer, which can lead to a pretty haunting sound, and the progression of the instrumental that really builds is quite powerful on War Over Land. And there are even moments where I like his flow, like on New Era, where the flow has quite a bit of variety. But there are so many moments here where the experimentation just doesn't work, and it doesn't feel like it has a clear purpose, and feels like the worst kind of abstract art. And the mixing is usually really bad, where you can often barely hear the rapping. And I guess if I'm going to look at it from the bright side, it means you're not hearing all the cringy and offensive bars, or his bad Kendrick Lamar impression that's all over this album, but it does still make the album worse, in addition to all the problems with the content, and the bad experimentation, and the really underwhelming rap delivery. And I have not even mentioned the attempts at rock music, which don't have nearly the bite that they did on his previous few albums when he tried it there. So yeah, this album's an absolute mess. Honestly, I'm feeling a fairly light 4 out of 10 on this album, and it's easily one of the most disappointing albums of 2026 thus far for me. I don't know how we got here less than 2 years after what I think is his best album, but if I tried to force myself to like this, I would not be honest with you or with myself. It's an absolute shit show of an album, barely saved from being truly horrendous by the occasional good line, listenable beat, or cool experiment. But regardless of whatever the intent with this album was, of which I may never be sure, although I am very curious, the album's not any good, and I'm glad most people have realized that. But okay, maybe that's not really fair of me to say, because I do want to hear what you think of this album. Music is subjective at the end of the day, so just because I think the album's bad doesn't mean it's objectively bad. But honestly, I do have a bit of a hard time seeing how somebody could defend this album. But again, it's just my opinion at the end of the day, so I'm curious to hear what you think. And if you do like the album, I'm curious to hear why. I was going to circle back a little bit to some of the other topics I was talking about hypocrisy and stuff like that, but this video is already way longer than I thought it would be, and it's taken way longer for me to make than I thought it would. So yeah, I think I've said all that I need to say for now. I'm well aware that some of the stuff in this video I said might be controversial, but I'm curious to hear other perspectives. If you disagree with anything that I said, feel free to let me know. I'm curious to hear some other opinions on not only the album, but on some of the other topics that I talked about as well. I think that's all I really got to say for now, though, in this video. Thank you for watching. Feel free to let me know what you thought of the album and or what you thought of my video. And yeah, I think that's it for now. I'm bad at doing these outros sometimes. So yeah, I'm just going to end it there. Thank you for watching. I will see you all soon.